This presentation is going to help you understand the factors that caused man to move from a more migratory existence to that of sedentary life and the origins of state building. So the reading targets that will go along with this are page 2 of the reading targets in the Unit 1 file. Hopefully you guys can look at those and follow along and see a lot of the terms that are going to be used. For me, one of the most confusing things about reading chapter 1 in the textbook is it's really hard for me to visualize the chronology of how these early hominids began to change and develop and what kind of tools and advancements are attributed to each of them. That's why I really like this human timeline here. Here you can see Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and then finally Homo sapiens. And what's attributed with each of them are some of the significant advancements that they were known for making. Also, you can see here, this here is Homo erectus, and this here is an image of Homo habilis. I put these in here so that hopefully you guys can see just how far man had come from these early forms here to that of Homo sapiens that began to settle down, create culture, began to farm, and really make the advancements of modern day civilizations. I'm also including here these images of their toolkits so that you can also see just how quickly they became advanced beyond these to develop some of the new cultural traits that are going to be in this presentation. So again, the question rises, how did man become sedentary? How did he go from being a migrant, moving all across the globe, to deciding that he was going to settle down? This presentation is going to address that. So there are several factors that caused man to stop being migratory. And the first 3 here, I'm going to draw this division here. These first 3 are really things that happen naturally that are beyond man's control. The scarcity of food. If a food source began to migrate and to leave an area, man had to either follow that food source or had no other choice but to stay where he was at. Not only that, but as man began to procreate more and populations began to rise, it was too difficult for man to be living a migratory existence. Coupled with changing weather patterns that were affecting the type of vegetation that were growing, man had factors that were affecting his ability to settle down or to move around, either one, which was beyond his control. So what we're going to focus on then instead are these bottom 3. These 3 traits were things that man began to develop slowly over time, which is what caused him to be able to settle down and to live a more modern existence and form states that developed government and economies, modern day civilizations as we know them. As was mentioned on the previous slide, the first factor that we're going to address that caused man to become more sedentary, that was not a natural phenomenon, meaning these were within his control, are those of farming techniques. The earliest and most simple of the farming techniques was known as slash and burn. It's a fairly simple process that I'll explain right now. What essentially happens is a wild food crop is discovered. The society then will cut down that local vegetation while saving the seeds from the plants. The remaining seeds are then planted in a different area of land as they are harvesting the initial vegetation. The part of the food crop that is not eaten, because it's obviously spoiling or for whatever reasons, it is left behind. But rather than leave it there to rot, what the societies would often do is burn the remnants of the vegetation. The ash combined with soil and the remnants of the crops actually forms a very fertile land. So what happens is the society then figured out that by planting the seeds back into that ashy soil that's super fertile would produce even more vegetation than the previous time. Hence, the first form of farming. Chinampas are another very early farming technique that were used by the Americans, primarily those in the Mexico and northern South American regions. Chinampas are great because what the Americans would do is they would build these mounds of mud that had these irrigation ditches. The beauty of these little irrigation ditches was that they provided just the right amount of water to seep into the mud mounds. That then kept the mounds of soil very fertile, which allowed them to produce the right amount of crop that they needed to sustain the society. Unfortunately, there's a lot of interaction with the environment with this method, and there's a lot of changing of the landscape with this, as was true with slash and burn, but slash and burn allowed the ash and the decayed vegetation to seep back into the soil. Here, there's a lot of transformation of the land in order to do this. Nonetheless, it was still very beneficial for early Mesoamerican societies. Obviously, it's fairly advanced that man began to figure out that if you took seeds from a vegetation and were able to replant it in a different area of soil, you would be able to grow another crop. That alone is a pretty significant technique that was used by early man, which obviously allowed him to stay sedentary. But one of the other things that we want to address here is domestication of animals. This is a huge step in allowing man to live a more sedentary existence. Dogs, they are great for herding, which were used for the sheep, which were used to produce wool or types of milk for the people to survive on. But some of the most significant animals that were domesticated were those that are considered pack animals: donkeys, llamas, horses, and oxen. Those were significant because they allowed them to travel long distances. They could still move around if they chose to have a more migratory existence, or to at least move farm crops from one part of the field to the other. Camels were also significant, especially in the Middle East and African regions, as they allowed people to move and to travel on an animal that could sustain itself in the desert. The idea of pack animals was significant in helping man to survive in a lot of harsh climates and to also move a lot of rocks around for construction and to exchange products in a bartering system. So pack animals were extremely important. Lastly, plant domestication was incredibly significant. Being able to recognize, and again, this connects with seed farming here, by recognizing that you are taking seeds and able to plant them is a form of domestication. The earliest of those plants that were domesticated were wheat, beans, corn, and then in Eastern Asia, like in China and Japan, soy and rice were cultivated. This ability to recognize that you can take plants and grow them how you choose them not only completes the circle of the most advanced form of farming, but it also shows that man no longer needed to move around anymore. He now had the capabilities to stay where he was and to start building up a society that could sustain the rising populations. The last trait on our list, which allowed man to settle down, was that he began to develop a much more sophisticated cultural identity. This advancing culture came in several different forms. Once man began to settle down, he began to start constructing large structures. That was the first. City building then came next, as well as the development of more sophisticated written languages, which also then led to the increasing artistic expression that was used by potters and other types of artisans in the area. We're going to talk about each of these separately, but please understand that they all are attributed to the idea of an advancing cultural development among man. First on our list is the construction of large structures. Man began to use those pack animals, as I mentioned before, to help him move large structures like stone. He was also able to carve and to cut out much larger structures of stone, which obviously tells us that the toolkit is advancing. In Egypt, for example, they developed things called mastabas, which were early structures that were used for burying the dead. Obviously, they became more advanced and were also used to then house the bodies of the pharaohs once they passed. Those were known as pyramids. The most significant of the largest structures in Egypt are those of the pyramids of Giza. In the Middle Eastern area of Mesopotamia, which includes the country of modern-day Iraq, a large structure that was constructed during that time were those of temples. Temples were very significant because they were centers of governance and prayer. This type of a system is known as a theocracy. A theocracy is one where you have religious leaders ruling as governmental leaders. So clearly there was a lack of a division between church and state, and especially in Mesopotamia. As you can see that priests would obviously rule and perform prayers and rituals in these large ziggurats, as they are called, these large temples. This is one of the most famous in Iraq. Other examples of dual-purpose large structures actually occurred on the other side of the globe, amazingly enough, without ever interacting with those of the Middle East. And that occurred in Mexico. The temples of Teotihuacan are extremely significant because they too are centers of prayer and governance. Here is the Temple of the Moon, and this is overlooking from the top of the Temple of the Sun. Both of these temples were served by priests who were not only leaders of the government, but also performed rituals and religious rites. Eventually, that will change over time, but in the very earliest development of these cities and state building, you can see that there was definitely a combination of church and state. Again, this would make early Mexico and the cultures that were there a theocracy. In Greece, they also constructed dual-purpose large structures. However, in Greece, they did not have a theocratic system of existence. They actually developed a citadel, and this is the citadel of Mycenae. Mycenae was one of the earliest states to form in very early development of Greece. But the citadel of Mycenae was not a temple, but instead it was a protective center where the military would keep guard and watch over the city, but also it was the center of the government. So it served this dual purpose. But this large structure also required advancing culture, advancing toolkits in order to have it constructed. Other very early civilizations that arose during this time were more known for more complicated city building before they were constructing massive structures. While Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia were focusing on these large temples and large structures from which the city developed later, places like in India, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro started off first as a city. You can see that they built some temples, but they were focusing on public works, bathhouses, and other services to meet the needs of the people in the society first, before they started constructing massive structures like temples and government buildings. So you can see here that city building was also an example of man starting to become much more culturally advanced. You can't have a city if you're too busy running around chasing wildebeests. Early civilizations in Africa also had city building. This is the city center called Djenné. It is in West Africa in the modern-day country of Mali. You can see here it looks very similar to that of Mohenjo-Daro. You can see that the buildings are not very large. In fact, they're somewhat small in comparison to those of Egypt and Mesopotamia and Greece. Again, the main focus was to develop a city for which the people could survive and exist before they started building up. They wanted to build out before they built up. But nonetheless, this requires definite advanced culture in order for them to construct these. On the eastern coast of Africa, in southern Africa, in the modern-day country of Zimbabwe, you can see here what is known as the Great Enclosure, in the area known as Great Zimbabwe. Again, very similar to that of Djenné in Western Africa, known as Mali. Here, Greece appears again, which should also indicate to you the significance of that Mediterranean region. Not only did Greece start developing large structures, but they began what was known as more advanced city building. The constructions of their cities were far more advanced than those of Djenné, Great Zimbabwe, and Mohenjo-Daro in India. Their cities consisted of very intricate public centers. They had markets, theaters, mints for coins, which was shocking at that time. They had assembly houses where politicians would go and debate and discuss. They had spas for cleaning, as well as providing housing and parks. It was much more advanced. We can just simply say that. One of the other things that made them significant was their classical style of architecture. This style of architecture is still copied today in a lot of American buildings, not just in America, but really I should say globally. What we're going to see in the next slide is an example of just how much more advanced the Greek city building became as they advanced over time when we take a look at the agora of the city-state of Athens. We will look at that in the next slide. This is a schematic showing you what the agora of Athens would have looked like. The agora is essentially the center marketplace of Athens, but really this is much more than a marketplace. You can see here a theater for plays. You can see here is where the assembly house would have met. There were lots of temples. There were shops. Okay, lots of places for people to go and to converse, trade, all sorts of those types of things. You even see toilets here, public toilets, pretty shocking for the ancient world. So you can see here that Greece blows Mohenjo-Daro out of the water when it comes to advancements. So you can see here, by the time we're getting the agora of Greece, we are nearing 600 BCE, the end of this unit. So that gives you an idea as to just how far man has become, especially if you go back and revisit the pictures at the beginning of this presentation with those early hominids of Homo habilis and Homo erectus. It's amazing how quickly man advanced from those civilizations to those of a little bit more migratory but yet advanced to then this. It's pretty impressive. Copying off of Greece's influence was Rome, that also created a political, cultural, and economic center. Just like Greek agoras, Rome built them up a little bit bigger and a little bit more numerous. They had them scattered throughout their region, whereas Greece only had a few. Okay, this here is the best example of a Roman agora. They call it the Forum, and this is where the Roman emperors would meet, where Roman senators would discuss, markets would thrive with people trading, just like that of ancient Greece. So far, we have discussed the construction of large structures and city building. Now what we want to discuss is the development of sophisticated written languages. The very earliest forms of written languages were those known as pictographs. Pictographs are those where images represent an idea, a concept. You can see here images of what look like animals or animals and humans kind of combined. This was the pictograph writing for the ancient Maya in Mesoamerica. Here you can see the earliest form of pictographs from ancient India, back when the Aryans and other Indo-Europeans had migrated into the Indian subcontinent and had made existence there and formed some cities there. However, over time, pictographs are going to also advance, as you know, with Egypt and hieroglyphics. Those are examples of pictographs. However, in other parts of the world, there were things called ideograms. You can see here Chinese writing, and here in Mesopotamia, the example of cuneiform. The idea of an ideogram is just like the root of the word. An idea is represented in a character. It has no connection to sound or vowels or alphabets. So an ideogram is like a pictograph. It just doesn't have a picture. It's a symbol that represents an idea. Again, we have to give props to ancient Greece because, again, they even have a more advanced form of a writing system. Greece was known for developing an alphabet. Well, what makes an alphabet? It's where the symbols actually have phonetic sounds. And voila, you have the ancient Greek alphabet down below there and some text. But ancient Greece was not the only place that developed an alphabet. Ancient Rome had it as well with the Latin-based alphabet, which is actually the root of most modern languages. It's the root of our language, Italian, Spanish, French, English. So, again, Greece is not the only one, but they were the first to come up with this most advanced form. Also, though, an alphabet formed in Eastern Asia. Sanskrit formed in India that is based on 48 different phonetic sounds, and you can see an example of it here. Again, showing you just how advanced man is becoming. There's no reason for man to migrate if he is developing such large structures for worship, if he is building cities, if he's farming, and if he's coming up with this language as a form of communication. He does not need to be chasing after food anymore. Last on our list of reasons why man no longer needs to move around and migrate is that of increasing artistic expression. You read in Spodek that man was already carving small portable forms of art, cave drawings, but as man is advancing in his toolkits, so is he in his artistic expression. And if they're building large structures, they then began to decorate them, placing significance and meaning to a lot of these structures, which therefore also kept people clinging, to a city. They don't want to leave if there's symbolic meaning to a lot of their buildings. So you can see here a term called a bas relief. These were very common in the civilization of Persia, which is in modern-day Iran. What often a bas relief is that you actually carve and chisel down the background of a picture so that the actual image in and of itself sticks out almost like a 3D image. Bas reliefs, again, were very popular in the Mesopotamian region of Persia, which is in Iran. You can see here more advanced portable art, especially than that of the one that we saw on our PowerPoint the other day. You can see that there's facial features on these statues. There's facial expressions. There's movement in the limbs and in the arms. So clearly man is becoming a lot more advanced and placing meaning to a lot of these structures. Nowhere was placing symbolic meaning upon structures more prevalent than in that of ancient Egypt. But ancient Egypt is also known for different forms of artistic expression that have transcended the test of time and have just fascinated historians for years, and that is with their literature. You can see here an excerpt from the Book of the Dead. This is the god Anubis, who is weighing a heart and a feather for the dead to determine if they will go into the afterlife. The fact that this is told solely through hieroglyphics, which are essentially a combination of pictograms and ideograms, is truly a testament to how advanced man has become. Here in ancient Egypt, the art of the Harappan and Indo-Aryans also shows advancing sculptural achievements. Here you can see more facial features and more detail on buildings and portable forms of art. Despite minimal contact with civilizations from the other half of the world, those in Mesoamerica were also contributing culturally to their civilizations. You can see here the Olmec civilization was known for developing these monumental structures, these giant stone heads, as they are called. It is believed that these stone heads represent kings and are a symbol of their power. If we're constructing these massive stone heads that cannot be moved, we are placing value upon a location, a city where that king likely ruled, which is therefore going to keep people anchored to that particular area, therefore cementing man's advancement from being from being migratory into a more sedentary existence. Portable art is also changing as well. Portable art was becoming more useful and serving everyday purposes. In Greece, what was considered portable art also served the dual purpose of holding food, liquids. Here you can see an advanced cultural trait in regards with metallurgy. What the heck is that, you probably ask? Metallurgy is the development and the working with metals. This here, the mask of King Agamemnon, who was king of the Mycenaeans in ancient Egypt, is clearly a testament to how well man is now developing working with other materials other than stone. He is now working with metals that he is able to heat, mold, and sculpt. Clearly, we are no longer in need of migrating. Hopefully this presentation has helped you to realize all of the different factors that have caused man to settle down. Some were natural and were beyond his control. Others were very much a result of man advancing and improving upon his toolkit. The development of culture, albeit in the form of farming, construction of large structures, city building, writing, and expressing themselves much more fluidly with art, are all things that contributed to the special place of cities and the reasons why man no longer had to go chasing for food. At this point, you should now be going into Canvas, where you can use your notes, reading targets, and this lecture to complete the Google form.